Hello everyone. So I'm Cory. I'm Senior Penetration Tester at KPMG. If any of you were at Liam's talk earlier, he's the boss. So hopefully he's coming today. But as a penetration tester, I think most of you know what that is. But I hack for a living. Being around between sort of infrastructure, networks, web apps, and other things. So, primarily an infrastructure tester, some unearthly research goes on the web app topic, but I'll get into why really as we progress. There will be some theory, so you'll have to power through that, but I'll get through it as quickly as possible. It's because it's a little bit of a lesser known topic compared to your XSSs and SSRFs, all the popular ones on ports when you're on that. But it is an interesting one if you can find a vulnerability to crack it. Okay. So I'll go through the sort of what and why of this talk in particular. Some of the theory. There will be some memes to intersperse theory. And then sort of a bit more of a sort of demo into what it all looks like, and then tips and tricks and finding issues and avoiding the sort of common pitfalls that you might see on an internal pen test report that's 5 years old and hasn't been updated in a while. So, why? So, the amount of times I've seen sentences like these two. So the application responded with the access control out origin header. If you don't know what that is, you'll hopefully learn that today. Meaning accepted requests from any origin, because there's an asterisk. Or the API responded to this request with the access control out object was true, therefore getting unauthorized access to any sensitive data from the app, regardless of what you do. Yet, what we don't see in any of these kind of reports are, has the tester, or have we, if we've written it, checked that the application is responding dynamically to our payloads? Have we checked that what we're trying to access is actually a protected resource and not just a generic homepage? Have we actually tested outside of Burp Suite at all? Have we verified that it's actually going to be an exploitable vulnerability, or are we just assuming it because we saw an ACAL header? And have we actually tried to exploit it in the first place? The answer is no to any of those, and whether you've seen it or haven't, hopefully today will be your help. So, what's the risk if you're more sort of businessy side of the person? Why am I saying it? So, essentially, these are sort of risks that you're trying to mitigate, right? So, external sites and subdomains authorized to access sensitive data. Those sort of more juicier targets can in some cases lead to account takeover or facilitate it. Compromise of internal networks is a pretty interesting sort of find, but sort of on the rarer side due to scope limitations. And all manner of other vulnerabilities that can also contribute to as well. But they can be really fiddly to find in the first place, even more fiddly to exploit. But you do look really cool when you do it. So, hopefully of use. So, we're going to begin with some theory. It's not the most exciting thing in the world. But you'll need to know it if you don't know much about calls, if you're going to try and find these things. Because of the aforementioned sort of quotes that we often see. So, what is origin? Same origin policy, I'm learning it. What is origin? It's actually this. So there are three parts to an origin, as far as web standards are concerned. So your URL scheme or protocol, your domain, inclusive of subdomains, important, and your port, which in 443 is going to be hidden in your URL bar, but it does count. So, key is cross origin. So when are we crossing an origin? So, essentially, if any one of these three components changes between your target, it is a change of origin. It's as simple as that. So if your port changes, which is sort of less likely, if your URL scheme changes, or subdomain changes, or crossing origin, right? If they're all the same, they're not similar. Right? So this is one thing you need to check when you're approaching this. So what is a SOP? So SOP is a security mechanism that is essentially prevents cross-origin attacks. It restricts scripts on the target origin from accessing data from a non-origin, with a few exceptions, but essentially including authentication information, so session cookies, sensitive data disclosed in the responses. So under the SOP, JavaScript scripts will be able to load resources hosted on another origin, but the JavaScript on the same page won't actually get out to read the content of these resources. So it's very restrictive. It's all designed to prevent you traversing origins and attacking websites. There are a few exceptions which are a bit technical and JavaScripty, so we can touch on that at the end if you wish, if you're a JavaScript person. But for all intents and purposes, this. So where does CORS come into play? Well, it comes into play because for web devs, if anybody has that sort of experience here, it's pretty inconvenient. There are plenty of times where you might legitimately want to access resources from some other origin, to load resources to host on your website, make it easier to navigate, prettier, etc. So the CORS allows for a relaxation of the SOP to allow you to do that. And essentially allow for cross-origin requests in a sort of controlled manner, ideally. So essentially it allows a retrieving origin, so my website that I have built, to issue cross-origin requests to some other website, which is something. And importantly, that's sent by the user's browser. This is critically important. You don't really have a CORS vulnerability if the browser is completely removed. It's making use of the browser, so the sending origin is when a user has an authenticated session, is using the client browser to then issue the request to some other origin. That's a common pitfall we'll get into later, but remember that you need a browser. So if permitted by site B, by the receiving origin, so by the retrieving origin, then you can retrieve the data, essentially. So there's a CORS policy on some target website. That's what it looks like in layman's terms. So that's everything I've just described. So the user visits some site, that site needs data from some other site, and there'll be a CORS configuration on there that will basically determine whether the sending origin is allowed to retrieve whatever resources it needs. There is this sort of area here that we'll get into in a bit, but essentially there are two types of cross-origin requests, which you will see, but one of which you actually see if you involve the browser instance. So, almost there. I'm trying to get to it. So, why do I care about some header exchanges and that sort of web standard scene? Well, essentially, for you to have a meaningful CORS vulnerability, you need a protected resource. You need a resource that you're trying to access that requires authentication. Right? We're not just interested in some generic homepage or dashboard or whatever. Right? That's not a meaningful vulnerability. Right? We need to determine whether we can issue what's called a credential request cross-origin, not just some generic thing. So, in other words, we need to be able to send credentials from one object to retrieve some juicy sensitive data. So we'll get into the two types of cross-origin requests. So, simple requests. They're simple. It occurs when you have one of three HTTP methods. So get, head, or post. We're all familiar with those hopefully. And also when you have a select number of content type headers in your HTTP request as well. If you have something else, then we'll have a proof line to go into. But this is essentially what it looks like in a very simplified way. So we have, I have a pointer, I don't know why I'm waving about. So we have our victim's browser. So go and visit .com, goes back, and then we're trying to send a credential request over to get some sensitive account info, specifying our e4.com. Victim receives that, and then sends back these two headers across. Access control allow origin, and access control allow credentials, among other things. But this origin and credentials are almost familiar if you've heard of CORS vulnerabilities. And then if permitted by our victim site's CORS policy, we'll send back the data to our e4.com via the victim's browser. Right? That's simple requests. Pretty straightforward. Just a few. Three-factor requests are a bit more complicated. And essentially they occur when you have other content type values. So you'll often see these more with JSON data being received. Most modern browsers will enforce pre-flights in these cases. And essentially what it involves is first sending an options request to the victim.com, and then the actual cross origin request. Essentially, the options request is going to solicit our victim.com on whether we're actually allowed to send a credentialed cross origin request. So we're sending this first, and then our account info request as well. So what that looks like essentially is here we have our options request. We specify what method we're going to use, and then if permitted, we get a whole series of access control headers from our victim.com. And if permitted, with true, and a dynamically generated origin header value, which matches our equal site, then we can retrieve that data. So we're sending two requests. That won't happen if you're just sending requests only in that reason. This is why I mentioned before, involve our browser in testing for these to demonstrate vulnerability. What we're here to do is demonstrate the vulnerability, demonstrate risk. So this is what it looks like. Hopefully this will play nice for us. It does. Okay, very good. So we're trying to get this API key over here, as you can see down there, from our victim site. Prepared a little JavaScript to retrieve it, and oh no, we can't. What's happening? So what we can see here is an options pre-flight. That comes back with the 200, but then with our following request, gets to 302, back to our login page. So our access request is essentially rejected. Why is that? So switch browsers here from the BERT browser to Microsoft Edge, and it's actually been allowed without changing anything else. So why is that? So we're seeing here, first the options pre-flight in the browser dev tools. We'll notice the content type, which is what we'll have initiated the pre-flight, and then our GET request, which has been honoured with an access of an account true header. Yes, we have. Right. So what we've seen there is an example of one browser behaving one way and another browser behaving a very different way. This was much to my surprise when I was preparing this talk, and isn't all that well documented unless you are actually a developer. Essentially, what's happening? No, we're not moving. We are moving, right. we'll get onto the explanation later, but to slow that down a little bit, this is what our pre-defined request looks like. So we have these specific headers here, method, headers, and origin. You will notice that although I am visiting the same site here and here in terms of domain, our ports change, therefore the different origin. In response to the options, we have a series of ACA headers as well, the important ones being origin and credentials. As well, our method has been allowed, and because it does have the content type for JSON, that's also being specified in response. In the actual course request, we see that our session cookie has also been included. That's what makes it credentialed. So essentially, it's now being permitted to authenticate there. Origin's still here. And we can see these headers have been repeated here as well, and we get our API key that we're looking for. So, essentially this is what I just covered. So, when we have credentials, what are credentials? So they're not just cookies, actually. That's the more common one we'll see. But also you'll have things like HTTP basic, ATLM authentication as well. Those are defined as credentials as far as the websites are concerned. And why is it important to know what isn't a credential? Well, because it's a bit tricky. Let's take basic and bearer authentication as an example. So some of us who might be either used to looking at these things or not will be used to saying process for specifying basic credentials in the browser. Essentially, when you try to authenticate to a resource that requests basic authentication, you're going to get back this www authenticate header. And in response, your browser is going to submit another request that authorizing basic, and your credentials, which are basically encoded. Some of the secure practice, usually a bit more secure than it sounds. But importantly, the browser will cache those credentials so that in the follow-on requests and subsequent requests for protected resources, it's going to automatically send those on to the target site. Not necessarily the same with bearer authentication. So bearer authentication, we have a similar looking authorization header, but those credentials aren't going to be automatically sent by the browser. So when we were talking earlier about the browser being essentially the middleman between legal.com and our target site, that's important because if it's not automatically sent by the browser, then the attacker performing this attack has to know the token beforehand. You can't just rely on the browser sending it by itself. So unless it's being stored in some really secure way by the browser, you're going to have to perform some other attack to get the token, and at that point, why perform calls export when you just get token and authenticate, right? So that's why it's sort of important. So bearer tokens are quite a bit trickier than other types of credential request. So controls, cookies, quite an annoying bit of research I ended up stumbling upon. So most of us will be familiar with the first two, so HTTP only, just prevent JavaScript from accessing or from accessing our cookies, and secure, prevents transmission of HTTP, all very well and good. But same site is less friendly. So there are three options you can choose from: strict, that's none. None doesn't really enforce the policy. But importantly, in the absence of our target app specifying it, most browsers will enforce LAX by default, so you won't necessarily know. So if not explicitly stated, most browsers will enforce LAX. And that includes popular browsers, Chrome and Chromium. Importantly as well, third-party cookies are started to be dropped by default in place of partition cookies and some other methods of cookie handling as well. So when you try to send a cross-origin request for the LAX policy in Chrome or Chromium, you get this message in console. And you can end up, if you have a managed browser, for instance, with these being turned on. So this is Edge, that's Chrome, I believe. And actually, it does affect the browser by default. So if you try to perform cross-origin request with Max on the same-side cookie that's applied to the session, then unless you explicitly tell the browser, don't do that, so stop your request, you're going to think that there's no exploit, but actually there is, you just need to tell it. Much to my own frustration. As a quick demonstration. So in this scenario, we'll have a cookie, which, here you go, that's what the browser currently does, and you see it limits it automatically. So that's what stopped up our proof of concept earlier on. Whereas Microsoft Edge just allows a third-party cookie. Currently, not doing shade on Microsoft, it's just the behavior that they want into their browser. So you see, that block has now worked in there. And you can see the cross-origin request as well. So be wary of the browser you use, or make sure you configure it correctly. Is this the same? This is the same. So, back to the same site. This is the last slide on it, I promise. So you have three settings currently. So either none, which is not all that common to see these days in my own experience, but it can happen. For non-Chrome browsers, this can be the default. On Chrome, as we've seen, and Chromium as well, won't allow that by default. Importantly, it's only permitted if the secure flag is set on the cookie. So if you're on more important blue team side of the fence, that's a good point to note. On LAX, there are two conditions only in which the browser will send a cookie that's applied on to a cross-site request. So the first interface uses the get method, any other method, it's not going to happen. And number two, if there's a top-level navigation, in other words, the user clicks something and they go to a website. In that case, the same site cookie will be sent cross-origin. And strict, the most strict, the browser will not just simply also. So that's, you're not going to have a fun time trying to exploit clause vulnerability in this case. This is essentially partly a response to sort of regulatory scrutiny on sort of third-party cookies and tracking, so we see price of partition cookies as well, and just general web security too. So, how can we avoid being a bit silly when trying to test vulnerabilities then? We've seen all of these controls, but how can we avoid them? So, the first thing is, and the first thing I most commonly see, is not checking that the application actually responds dynamically to origin payloads. We have this straight from Mozilla's documentation. When responding to a credentialed request, the server must specify an origin in the value of an ACAL header instead of specifying a wild. So if you're not getting a dynamically generated origin back from the server, so you go origin eth.com in your request, if it's not being dynamically generated, it's likely not got an issue there. Because that's just not happening. And so essentially what that looks like is this. So regardless of what you're sending in your origin header, it's just responding with the same thing over and over again. And number 2 and 3, not checking that the resource actually requires authentication. So here, our home.php is not that interesting resource to catch for a cross-origin request, unless it's got some serious issues with information disclosure, and also not testing outside of that. As we saw before, we not only need a live browser, especially when you're going to send this to a victim, but also different browsers will behave differently by default, and you need to account for that. So when we're reporting, we have to account for the fact for what kind of users are actually accessing the site. If it's on the internet or corporate environment, then Microsoft Edge might feasibly be more common one used by our users than Chrome, for instance. So some final notes. I mentioned partition before. Essentially, this is a new-ish attribute that can be set on cookies. Essentially, it adds what's called a sort of partition key to our cookies. And what it means is that when you have an embedded site within your own website, it's essentially stopping, it's preventing that cookie from being accessed across origin and by another embedded, when that website is also embedded. So, as a summary, don't be fooled by that. If you have been fooled, there's no shame in it, but try not to go down the rabbit hole there. And also make sure your ACAD is dynamically generated. Double check what the credentials are. So if you've got a bearer token, for instance, or if what you're testing is a standalone API that's used by service or machine accounts that isn't going to be accessed in a browser. So make sure that you know the context of the system that you are testing, and always check the cookie attributes as well, and will guide you for your proof of concepts as well. So you've heard me drone on a lot, so thank you for listening. You can find me in one place and one place only, and that's LinkedIn, which is a little bit sad. I put the sort of full link there, as if anybody's going to type that manually in. I just look up Cory Turner, KPMG, and you'll find me, hopefully. Thank you all for listening, and let's go on forward to any questions. It's going to that one day. I won't take it back. But yeah, if you have any questions or just wish to discuss web security, I will point you to Liam. He knows it far better than I do while I'm nodding along. But yeah, thank you for listening, and see you throughout the rest of the day.